Boss by Bossman, right?
Hey, what's up, everybody? I'm Dr. Regina Bradley, and this is OutKasted Conversations, Season 2, Episode 4. Count them, 1, 2, 3, 4. And the guest that we have is just so phenomenal and so amazing. My friend, my sister, my colleague, Dr. Michelle Hite from the Spelman College. Dr. Hite, how you?
Doing well, thank you.
You doing good? Look good and everything? Got
Thank
the
you.
J's on?
Yeah.
Just, okay.
I was coming to see you.
Oh, okay, I'm ready. So you got to answer the question to get into the club. How did you become outcasted?
My now husband, who was my boyfriend then, I can't imitate he was like a natural kind of beatboxer, flower. And I'm like, what is this? What is this song? And he was like, it's OutKast. And so I started listening, and I was hooked from the beginning.
Shout out to the husbands that use OutKast to pitch the woo.
Because
my husband used OutKast to pitch the woo. He used to play the little prototype song.
Right.
So thanks, Roy.
That's it.
So yeah, let's go ahead and just jump into it. I am just so mesmerized is the word by your work on trauma and Black men's vulnerability, particularly Black men vulnerability as it relates to the South.
Right.
So you wrote an essay for the OutKast anthology that I'm trying to finish.
You will.
And you talk about André 3000's use of the Atlanta child murders to speak to his own vulnerabilities as a Southern Black man. Can you tell us a little bit about, what was the influence of that and what you're arguing in that essay?
Well, and largely, going back to my husband, right, and my interest in OutKast, I remember the moment when I understood that when people were talking about the inner city, I lived there. For years, when people talked about it, I didn't get it. It was just sort of this haunted, blighted landscape that had nothing to do with my life. So I can't explain why I understood that description was supposed to fit me, but I did. And for me, it became a moment that I understood that I had to reject it, right? So I was sort of dedicated to reclaiming the truth of what I understood about being loved, about the complexity of the people who I knew and what their lives looked like. And I think a part of that rejection was also recognizing sort of fellow travelers. What I heard in OutKast was that recognition for the love, for the integrity, and you would get it through the way that they would so comfortably cite Black people, the language, the rhythm of the speech, the food. So I was reading articles about the Atlanta child murders, probably in preparation for a class that I teach. And I usually have my freshmen use the Atlanta child murder series from the Maynard Jackson collection that's at the Robert Woodruff Library at the AUC.
You call it the funeral box.
I call it the funeral box because Maynard Jackson, the first Black mayor of a southern city, was mayor during this time. So I remember being a child and first just in general feeling vulnerable and fragile and afraid. And I remember that time. So when I started teaching at Spelman, I thought, this would be a great opportunity to teach students about this period using these papers. So I knew kind of what I was looking for, but I didn't quite understand the kinds of things I would find in that collection. So there were prisoners who were sending in donations to try to help, to find this person. And so it's rich with all this correspondence. And eventually I found what I call the funeral box, right? So there were obituaries, and they're really sad because, some of these kids are like 10. And there weren't lots of pictures of them, right? So sometimes that the photograph that's in the box is the only one that's available. Right. So I thought, because my work deals with death and mourning, this would be wonderful to give students a sense of what it was like to be young, to be poor, to be vulnerable. And many of them come to understand that a part of what that means is that you don't have a phone, right? It meant that the parents of the children couldn't dress the dead child. They often couldn't dress themselves. So you see the receipts, right, coming from this office. So I send my students there. So in the meantime, every semester I kind of would refresh what I'm looking for. So Travis Scott had just come out with the ends.
Right.
And Andre's featured on the track. So there are people who are writing about how he had talked about this, okay? And I understood that, right? Because I love thought process. I love Goody Mob. So listening to Andre on thought process, listening to him on Aquemini, and then the ends, what it seemed to me is that, again, thinking about my own recognition of what it was like to be young and vulnerable, and to also understand that I'm loved, right? I could hear him trying to come to language about what it was like to feel afraid. That discourse, when it comes to Black people, is typically absent, right? The culture is ostensibly so afraid of us that what I heard in him was a reclamation of that vocabulary for his own experience, right? So when I listen to the ends, what is so clear to me is that Andre is hearing Travis almost sort of referencing OutKast, like citing moments from his, archive, if you will. And Dre is sort of thinking, okay, but right, this stuff you're talking about being out at 10 o'clock. There was a call to parents to find your children and get them in because someone was killing them.
So there was a real legit reason for you to be home by the street lights.
Listen, there was a real legit reason, and this was a time when there had not been this kind of the helicopter parent didn't exist, right? And people would just send their kids out to play, so there was no stranger danger until this moment. So it's inaugural, right? But what's interesting about that particular history when the ends comes out is that Tamir Rice has been killed, Ayanna Stanley Jones has been killed, Trayvon Martin has been killed, Mike Brown has been killed. That past is present. And so what Dre is saying is, okay, not only could that boy have been me, I am every Black boy, right? So any Black boy is in this recollection, right? And also in this present.
And it's still haunting them, right?
And it's still haunting him. Because of what I talk about in that essay is that if it is the case that people are killing Black children, okay, and that it's always killing season for Black children, we were not meant to be adults. So if you become a Black adult, you are like a foreigner, right? Because foreigners are in this new place. If you're a Black adult, you're in a place that you were never intended to be.
Or that you never expected to be, right? So if you listen to like Goody Mob and OutKast, they always talk, there's I never expect to make it past 25,
That's it.
right? And it's like, I'm 26, I'm in my 30s,
Right.
or, where those folks now are in their 40s, right? So it's like, Dr. Brooks was talking about how horror for Black folks, especially Southern Black folks, is complicated. Like we use horror to think about the past, the present, and the future. And I've said it before, is, horror for me is a reaction to the trauma that Black folks have experienced. And the ends is a reflection of that horror and the residual effects of that horror. So I think it was a couple of years ago, folks started finding, more bodies.
Right.
And folks were like, oh shit, is this the Atlanta child murders all over again?
Yeah.
And I wanted to ask you about how not necessarily reflection is a form of nostalgia, right? But that looking back, what does that do in terms of how we engage Southern hip hop specific influence? Because there's a lot of remembrance, there's a lot of memorials in Southern hip hop. And I'm just curious to hear your thoughts about, how do we use hip hop to kind of update the conversations that we're having about what trauma can do for the Southern Black community?
Well, one of the things that I think about what's happening in the ends in particular is that you see an intergenerational conversation taking place. And so a part of what Dre does is he assumes the role of an elder talking to a younger man about this gift, and the gift is his survival, right? So part of what he's passing on and communicating is what he has understood, right, about the experience of coming of age and surviving, making it. And so a part of our endurance requires that what we were calling post-Trayvon Martin, the talk, right? So for me, I mean, yeah, it is a sort of like, it's a looking back, but I think a part of the experience of being a Black person is always trying to come to language about what is constantly being denied, right? The infliction of the violence. And so it doesn't always look like a list. And a child can't necessarily explain the context, the tone, or the setting, the environment, the milieu that is creating the experience of violence. So a part of what it means to have survived that and to be aware, right, of it is to attempt to try to come to language about it. So for me, a part of what hip hop does so brilliantly is come to invent a language, right? I mean, it invents a language with a very clear relationship to an attempt to remix the past so that you hear it anew. Right? So that idea that the contemporaneousness of the past as present, right, gets underscored in hip hop. I think a part of the brilliance of OutKast is a knowing awareness of this effort to come to language. I mean, because, and we talked about it the last time we were together, Toilet Tisha. Right. I mean, it's a brilliant attempt to, to reconcile what it must be like to be a young Black girl, and any young Black person is estranged from a discourse of shame, right? Like, we're supposed to be shameless people. Right. But here you have this girl who is ashamed because her mother has expectations for her, right? And again, in an American culture, the construction of Blackness is shamelessness without expectations. And this young girl, can't face her mother's disappointment. And that documentation of the possibility for that kind of nuanced life in this place that, all these people that I knew growing up in schools, these teachers who would talk about this inner city, that's the kind of denial, right, that they were putting forth as an accurate sort of description of where I lived. Right. So part of what they're looking back, if you will, or maybe just looking at the Black experience is a way of trying to tell those stories.
So I want two things.
Yeah.
The first thing that you were talking about, like finding language to articulate these particular experiences that otherwise would be pushed to the side. And language in that aspect isn't just words. Like, I think that's one of the things I really appreciate, not just about OutKast, but also about just, Southern hip hop in general, is we use grunts, we use moans, we use all of these things that are like, I can't enunciate in a particular way, but I can use these other sounds which sonically are alerting you to the particular type of agency that I'm trying to bring.
That's right.
Right? And when you came to my OutKast class last semester, my students only wrote about you, by the way. I'm like, I taught the class, but there's no, my feelings. I was in my feelings a little bit, but it was good that it was you.
Yeah.
We had this really you brought in Kevin Quashie.
Yes.
And Kevin
Who I
Quashie
love.
wrote The Sovereignty of Quiet,
Yes.
right? And normally when you think about Southern Black folks, you don't think about quiet.
Right.
But can you talk a little bit about, how that quiet is a reflection or even a sonic marker of how Southern hip hop artists think about what their vulnerabilities and traumas are?
And you were with me when we saw Kevin Quashie at ASA. And I mean, like I told that brother, I walk around like I'm your emissary. I mean, I think that work is so
Read your book.
Important.
Yes.
Because it is not what he suggests, right? What he contends is that it's important to recuperate quiet and Black quiet, because it recognizes Black subjectivity that is not always in protest.
Yes.
Okay. So to that point, in the essay Andre's Dread, I have Andre in conversation with James Baldwin, who comes south from France to write about his experience of the Atlanta child murder. So in the Maynard Jackson archive, he first gave that interview he gave that story to Playboy, okay? So students read the Playboy article. So what becomes very interesting to me is the way that the book begins with Baldwin is that he can't figure out if his sort of thinking about a boy's fear is a boy telling him a story or if the boy is himself, okay? So he tells this story about the boy. So the boy, him or this boy, or another boy, tells a story about being abducted, and he's in a car. And Baldwin says there is the tom-tom silence, okay, of being in this truck. That's important because for Baldwin, the moment when those Black folk are enslaved on the west coast of Africa, looking out at the Atlantic Ocean, it's the death of language and the beginning of a sound, right? So a part of what happens is what you can't articulate is where you're going, right? And the language that would be available to you, okay, you're estranged from it, and the story that it wants to tell about you, it others you, okay? It removes you from humanity. So for Baldwin, music becomes important because it's the recuperation of the possibility for articulating what your life means. So a part of why I think the quiet becomes very important is because it's the potential for Black subjectivity, right? So for Baldwin then, you need the music because music is the place where we begin to try to make it make sense. And there are all these various valences that you're talking about where Black people are trying to document their own witness to their experiences, their subjectivity, and you get that in OutKast in particular. You get that recognition for the need to figure out how you communicate for the sake of endurance, how you communicate with a language that was not intended for your endurance, as a subject, as free, as human. So yeah, I think that gets at it.
Yeah, I think so. I got one more question, and I think this is kind of like a piggyback off of that. So Quashie also talks about quiet as a reflection of Black folks' interiority.
Yeah.
What does that interiority look like in Southern hip hop? Because on the one hand, we're expected to be boisterous and loud and in your face, and we perform these things with great ease.
Yeah.
But I think what's even more important is that even in between, I guess those breaks between this hyper performance of what you think Southern Blackness is supposed to be, you get glimpses into a Southern interiority that folks either don't recognize or they don't even realize that it exists. So, how can we think about this idea of quiet as a means to complicate what the interiority of Southern Black folks can do?
Well, one of the things I like to stress to students about double consciousness is that you have to remember that there was a moment when Du Bois didn't realize that there was this other gaze that would imprison him and that he would have to see himself through, right? I think a part of what Black interiority and this idea of quiet, right, and that is not responsive to that recognition, it's the site of liberatory possibility because it's not governed from without, right? So that's the space where the freedom dreams come from. I think a part of our promise is if you recognize the truth of that witness and you pay attention to it and you claim it, not necessarily defend it because it's just not true what people are saying, right? So I think a part of what you get, from Black Southerners, and Bell Hooks talks about this too, those Southern Black women who curated the walls in their homes with photographs of us, as she says, in our glory. Right?
And also your office is dope like that in the same way.
And what I was doing was trying to reconstruct my grandfather's music room, but our basement that was filled with photographs of Black people enjoying one another's company, graduating from high school, having picnics, having dinner, going to church. And so, what she says is that it was important that those women did that because it reclaimed the subjectivity that had been so demeaned in the larger culture. So, imagine Zip Coon and Mammy and Jezebel, but in your grandmother's house, that was not what that looked like. Right?
Not saying that it wasn't part of the family.
It wasn't. That's right.
You got a couple in the family.
But that wasn't on her walls.
But that also wasn't her main concern.
There you go. Exactly. And so I think what the music does is it extends that kind of witness of that documentation sonically, right? It records it. It tells the story of those interior lives. And I mean, certainly within the person, but within the homes, within the spaces that we created, and shares it, not defensively, but as fact. This is true. This food was this good. My uncle spoke this way. He communicated to me, and that was meaningful, and that's yours, right? That you don't have to live responsively. You can live within the vision of what we imagine for ourselves. Yeah, so I think that's a part of what's so important.
Well, Dr. Hite, I love you, but thank you so much for sharing the insight and the brilliance, and definitely giving me a lot to think about in terms of, this idea of the quiet and the interior. Thank you so much. Thank you for having us.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, I tried. I'm Dr. Regina Bradley. This is OutKasted Conversations. We'll see y'all next time. Y'all be easy.